Chapter 261. Tokyo, Japan, December 26, 1897. The morning after the attack, the imperial palace was under tight lockdown. Soldiers patrolled the gates, their hands gripping the hilts of their katanas and the stocks of their rifles. Their gazes sharp and wary. Smoke from torches curled into the cold air, adding to the somber weight that hung over the city. Inside the palace walls, tension simmered. What was meant to be a historic celebration had been marred by violence. And now, Japan stood at a precarious crossroads. Matthew Hesh stood in the grand hall where the banquet had taken place. The remnants of shattered glass and overturned tables still visible. His security detail remained close, their eyes scanning every movement, every shadow. All foreign dignitaries, including the Emperor of China, the King of Korea, and the British Prime Minister, had immediately retreated to their respective embassies under heavy guard. The attack had shaken the entire diplomatic corps. Everyone was on edge. Whoever orchestrated this knew exactly what they were doing, Collins muttered, standing beside Matthew. He flipped through a small notebook where he had scrawled hasty notes from the previous night. They struck when everyone was gathered in one place. If they had succeeded, we could have been looking at the assassination of multiple world leaders in one night. Matthew nodded, his jaw tightening. And yet they failed, which means we still have time to figure out who's behind this before they try again. Across the hall, Japanese officials were conducting their own investigation. Palace guards interrogated the remaining staff, cross-checking every movement, every potential security breach. The Shinsengumi, Japan's elite counterinsurgency force, had been deployed to hunt down any accomplices the assassin might have had. Matthew turned to one of his agents. "Where's Whitaker?" "Downstairs, sir," the agent replied. "He's going through the assassin's belongings with the Japanese investigators." Matthew exchanged a look with Collins. "Let's go." The basement of the Imperial Palace had been turned into a makeshift investigative headquarters. Japanese and Amarathian officials worked side by side, piecing together whatever clues they could find. Attorney General Whitaker stood near a wooden table, examining the assassin's rifle. It was an older model, not standard Japanese military issue, and worn from heavy use. A small, crumpled letter lay beside it, along with a bundle of personal belongings. Matthew approached. "What do we have?" Whitaker glanced up, rubbing his temple. "Not much, but enough to make things interesting." He gestured toward the rifle. "It's a European-made firearm, most likely smuggled into Japan. The markings indicate it came from the Russian Empire." Matthew frowned. "Russia? Possibly," Whitaker replied. "We need to confirm. But if this weapon was supplied by a foreign power, it complicates things." Collins exhaled sharply. "The last thing we need is an international crisis." One of the Japanese investigators, a stern-looking man named Commander Takeda, stepped forward. "We found this among his belongings." He handed Matthew a small piece of parchment. Matthew unfolded it, his eyes scanning the text. "The old ways must be restored. The weak cannot lead. The rightful rulers must rise again." There was no signature, no emblem, just a vague declaration of intent. Matthew passed the paper to Collins. "Sounds like a nationalist faction." Takeda nodded. "That is our current belief. There are radical groups in Japan who oppose modernization. They see Emperor Yoshihito as a symbol of weakness, too influenced by the West. They want to return Japan to its feudal past." Matthew crossed his arms. "Would they be bold enough to attack their own emperor?" Takeda hesitated. "Some might, but something doesn't add up. If this was purely a nationalist attack, why target the foreign dignitaries as well? There were plenty of opportunities to strike Yoshihito directly before now." Matthew considered that. Then maybe someone else used the nationalists as cover. Whitaker set down the rifle. "And if this gun did come from Russia, we might be looking at more than just a local uprising." The foreign embassies were in a state of panic. By noon, official statements had been issued from every major power present at the ceremony. The Chinese emperor had called for a full-scale investigation and declared that any attempt on his life would be met with swift and severe retaliation. The British government condemned the attack, promising to heighten security across all diplomatic engagements in Asia. The Russian delegation, however, remained oddly silent. The Amarathian embassy had been reinforced with additional security, with Orders that no one left or entered without direct authorization. The attack had put every nation's representatives on high alert. That afternoon, Matthew was summoned to a private meeting with Emperor Yoshihito. The young emperor had taken control of the situation remarkably well, but there was a fire in his eyes that betrayed his anger. "You must understand," Yoshihito said, his voice calm but firm, "this attack was not just against me. It was an attack on Japan's future." Matthew nodded. "I understand, Your Majesty, which is why we need to get to the bottom of this quickly. If there's a foreign hand in this, we need to find it before things escalate." Yoshihito studied him. "And if it is a foreign power?" Matthew exhaled. "Then we deal with it together." A silence settled between them. Yoshihito nodded. "Japan appreciates Amarathia's support." Matthew leaned forward. "If I may be frank, Your Majesty, who do you suspect?" The emperor's expression darkened. "There are whispers. Some say rogue elements within the military aristocracy may be involved. Others believe radical nationalists acted alone, but the idea of foreign influence is troubling." Matthew nodded. "We'll work together to get answers." Colin's discovery later that evening, as Matthew was reviewing reports in his temporary residence, Collins entered the room, looking grim. "We may have something," Collins said, placing a telegram on the table. Matthew picked it up and read the message. "Unknown ship spotted near Kyushu coast. Possible foreign operatives attempting to flee. Request immediate response." Matthew's gaze snapped to Collins. "If they're running, they were involved." Collins nodded. "The Japanese Navy is already mobilizing, but I suggest we send a detachment from the Pacific Fleet to assist. If these are our guys, we can't let them slip away." Matthew didn't hesitate. "Tell Admiral Parker to prepare a pursuit team. We set sail immediately." The attack had failed, but the consequences were just beginning. Someone had tried to use Japan's transition of power to ignite chaos. Someone had armed radicals with foreign weapons. Someone was still out there, trying to cover their tracks. And Matthew Hesh wasn't going to let them get away with it. As he prepared to leave for the chase, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just an assassination attempt, it was the beginning of something far bigger. Chapter 262. December 27, 1897. Aboard the USS Amarathia, the salty wind howled across the deck of the USS Amarathia as it cut through the Pacific waters, its powerful engines humming beneath the steel plating. The moonlight reflected off the dark waves, casting an eerie glow over the ocean. The Pacific Fleet, now on high alert, moved in tight formation, ready for battle if needed. Matthew Hesh stood on the bridge, gripping the railing as he watched the vast expanse of water ahead. The Japanese Navy had already begun their pursuit from Kyushu, but the Amarathian fleet had the advantage of speed and firepower. "Admiral Parker," Matthew said, turning to the seasoned commander standing beside him, "how far ahead are the targets?" Parker adjusted his spyglass before responding. "Approximately 30 nautical miles ahead." The Japanese reported that they've identified at least 3 unknown vessels, possibly disguised merchant ships. "Any confirmation on their nationality?" Parker frowned. "None yet, but if they were truly merchant ships, they wouldn't be running like this." Collins, who had been scanning intelligence reports, approached. "Sir, we intercepted a transmission from one of our outposts near the Ryukyu Islands. The fleeing ships are attempting to communicate with someone unknown code. Encrypted." Matthew exchanged a glance with Parker. "Could they be calling for reinforcements?" "That's a possibility," Parker admitted. "We need to intercept before they have a chance." Matthew exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. This was no longer just about finding the people responsible for the attack. This could escalate into something far worse. "Captain Rogers," Parker called to the officer at the helm, "increase to flank speed. I want us closing the gap within the hour." "Aye, sir." Rogers barked as he relayed the order to the engine room. The USS Amarathia surged forward, the rest of the fleet following in its wake. Approaching the unknown ships, the Amarathian fleet now had visual confirmation of their targets. 3 ships, sailing under no identifiable flags, were zigzagging across the waves in an attempt to shake pursuit. The largest vessel, a heavily modified cargo ship, was lagging behind, struggling to keep up with the other 2. "They're not built for speed," Collins muttered, peering through a pair of binoculars. "They're carrying something." Matthew nodded. "Or someone." Admiral Parker turned to his officers. "Prepare a boarding party. We'll take the largest ship first." A signal was sent to the Japanese fleet, instructing them to handle the other 2 vessels while Amarathia took the lead on the main target. "Send a final warning," Matthew ordered. "Tell them to stop or be fired upon." A signal lamp flashed across the dark waters, delivering the ultimatum. For a tense moment, silence stretched between the 2 forces, then a sudden muzzle flash from the enemy ship. "Incoming fire." Bullets whizzed through the air, striking the hull of the Amarathian destroyer leading the charge. Cannon fire erupted from one of the enemy ships, sending a shell screaming past the USS Amarathia's bow. Return fire. Parker barked. The Amarathian ships roared to life, deck guns unleashing volleys that tore into the enemy hulls. The Japanese fleet, seeing the attack unfold, joined the battle with precision artillery strikes. The sea became a battlefield as the battle raged. The Amarathian Marines prepared for an assault. Matthew, despite his high rank, refused to remain idle. Dressed in a naval officer's coat and armed with a revolver, he stood with the boarding party. "You don't have to do this, sir," Collins said, eyeing him warily. Matthew smirked. "I didn't come all this way to watch from the sidelines." The USS Amarathia pulled alongside the enemy vessel, and with grappling hooks securing the two ships together, the Marines stormed aboard. Gunfire erupted as enemy combatants clad in mixed military and civilian clothing opened fire from behind crates and barrels. Matthew ducked behind cover as bullets pinged off the steel railing. "Suppressive fire," he shouted. The Marines moved with tactical precision, returning fire while advancing down the deck. The enemy forces fought desperately, but they were outmatched as Matthew and his team pressed forward. A Japanese officer from the Allied boarding party ran up to him. "We found something below deck." Matthew didn't hesitate. "Show me." The lower levels of the cargo ship were dimly lit and reeked of oil and damp wood. The moment Matthew stepped inside, he knew something was wrong. The first thing he noticed were wooden crates stacked high, each marked with foreign insignias, weapons. Collins ran a gloved hand over one of the crates, prying it open. Inside, neatly packed rows of rifles, pistols, and ammunition gleamed under the lantern light. "These aren't just any weapons," Collins said, inspecting the craftsmanship. "They're Russian." Matthew clenched his jaw. The implications were clear. If these weapons were being smuggled into Japan, it meant there was a deliberate effort to destabilize the country from within. Then, from the far side of the room, a low groan, a man, bound and gagged, was slumped against the wall. A Japanese nobleman, judging by his fine yet tattered robes. His face was bloodied, his eyes wide with recognition the moment he saw them. Takeda, the Japanese investigator who had joined the boarding party, rushed forward. "It's Lord Nakamura." Matthew turned sharply. Who?" Takeda's face was grim. "A close advisor to Emperor Yoshihito. He disappeared 2 months ago. We thought he had been assassinated." Collins exhaled sharply. They were keeping him alive. Matthew knelt beside the injured man, untying his gag. "Lord Nakamura, can you speak?" The nobleman coughed violently, his voice hoarse. They wanted me to sign a decree to declare Yoshihito unfit to rule." Matthew's stomach turned. "Who did this?" Nakamura's gaze was filled with fear. "The Russians," he whispered. The room fell silent. Collins exchanged a grim look with Matthew. "Well, that confirms it." Matthew straightened with a cold expression. "Get him medical attention. We need him alive." Takeda nodded, signaling for the Japanese medics. Matthew turned back to Collins. "Send word to Yoshihito. We have our answer." Collins exhaled. "This changes everything." Matthew nodded. The attack on the succession ceremony had just escalated into an international crisis. As he walked back toward the deck, the realization settled in. This wasn't just about Japan anymore, it was about global power. And Amarathia had just stepped into the center of it. Chapter 263. December 28, 1897, Tokyo, Japan. The Imperial Palace. The grand chamber of the Imperial Palace was filled with tension, so thick it could have been cut with a blade. The Japanese Imperial Court, led by Emperor Yoshihito's closest advisors, had gathered alongside Amarathian diplomats and military officers. Lord Nakamura, still weak from his captivity but stabilized after medical treatment, sat in a heavily guarded section of the room. At the center of the dispute stood Matthew Hesh and Japanese Minister of Justice Hiroshi Takamura, locked in a heated debate over who had the authority to interrogate the captives taken from the smuggler ship. "The attack happened on our soil," Takamura said firmly, his voice carrying across the hall. "Under Japanese law, we have jurisdiction. These men were captured in our waters, near Kyushu. Their crimes are an affront to the imperial throne, and thus, they must be judged under our laws." Matthew's gaze remained sharp, his expression unreadable. He had anticipated this argument, but that didn't mean he would accept it. "Minister Takamura," he began, his voice measured, "these captives aren't just criminals. They're co-conspirators in an attack against an international gathering of world leaders. That means this isn't just Japan's problem, this is a global crisis. The world deserves answers." Takamura narrowed his eyes. "With all due respect, President Hesh, Japan is fully capable of handling this matter. We do not need foreign interference in our judicial process." Matthew leaned forward, his fingers pressed together. No one is questioning Japan's sovereignty, he said, but let's not pretend that this attack was just about Japan. The Russians, he let the word linger, supplied these people with weapons. They kidnapped and tortured a member of your own government. They attempted to destabilize your leadership. They orchestrated an attack meant to destabilize the world. If we let politics get in the way, they'll win. A low murmur spread through the room. Some of the Japanese ministers exchanged glances while others maintained their stoic expressions. Takamura exhaled sharply. We will interrogate the captives and share our findings with the Amarathian government. Matthew's jaw tightened. That's not good enough. Takamura's eyes flashed with irritation. You do not dictate how Japan handles its affairs, Mr. President. We are not one of your colonies. The insult was clear, and the room went dead silent. Collins, who had been standing behind Matthew, took a step forward, his posture tense. Admiral Parker folded his arms, clearly restraining himself. Matthew, however, remained calm. He had been in too many diplomatic battles to let an insult shake him. Minister Takamura, he said evenly, you misunderstand me. I have no intention of treating Japan as anything less than an equal partner. But let me be clear, if these men are part of something larger, we cannot afford to let them disappear into a closed investigation. I won't allow it. The weight of the statement hung between them. Takamura's lips thinned. Are you threatening Japan, Mr. President? Matthew slowly stood. The room stiffened. I don't make threats, he said, his voice calm but firm. I state realities, and the reality is that the world is watching. If Japan tries to bury this investigation, it will be seen as a cover-up, and that minister would make it seem as though Japan has something to hide. The accusation was subtle but deadly. The ministers shifted uncomfortably. Even Emperor Yoshihito, who had been silent, looked at Takamura with a questioning gaze. Takamura clenched his fists but knew he had been cornered. If Japan refused to cooperate, they would face political backlash from every foreign nation present at the attack. Emperor Yoshihito finally spoke, his voice calm yet authoritative. A joint interrogation, he said, conducted by both Japanese and Amarathian authorities. Takamura's head snapped toward the emperor, his expression stunned. Your Majesty, I must. Yoshihito raised a hand, silencing him. I have decided. Takamura bowed stiffly, but his clenched jaw made it clear he was furious. Matthew didn't allow himself to show satisfaction, though inside, he knew they had won this battle. Thank you, Your Majesty, he said, bowing respectfully. This is the right decision. Yoshihito nodded. Then let the interrogation begin immediately. The Imperial Detention Hall was dimly lit, the smell of burning incense lingering in the air. The captured conspirators, restrained in heavy iron shackles, were lined up in separate cells. Some remained silent. Their expressions defiant, others looked shaken. Knowing what awaited them, Matthew stood beside Takeda, the lead Japanese investigator, while Collins and Whitaker remained nearby. Minister Takamura was absent, having begrudgingly left the process in their hands. We start with him, Takeda said, pointing to a middle-aged man with a scar across his cheek. Two guards dragged the prisoner into the interrogation room and chained him to the chair. He wore tattered clothes, his lips dry and cracked from dehydration. Matthew took a seat across from him. Name. The man remained silent. Takeda nodded at the guards. A swift punch struck the prisoner's gut, forcing him to gasp for air. Name, Takeda repeated. After a few deep breaths, the man finally muttered, Dmitry Orlov. Matthew's eyes narrowed. Russian. Orlov glared at him but didn't speak. You were carrying Russian weapons? Collins interjected. Smuggled into Japan? Who gave them to you? Orlov chuckled bitterly. You think I'll just tell you? Matthew leaned forward, his voice low and cold. You have two choices, Dmitry. You can tell us what we need to know, or you can spend the rest of your miserable days buried beneath this palace, forgotten. Orlov's jaw clenched. Takeda signaled to the guards. One of them unceremoniously snapped a finger on Orlov's hand. He let out a sharp cry, his breath coming in ragged gasps. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Orlov hissed. Matthew studied him carefully. Then educate me. Orlov's eyes flickered toward the ceiling. You think we are some remnant faction? Some minor rebellion? He gave a humorless laugh. You're already too late. Matthew's stomach tightened. Too late for what? Orlov smirked. blood dripping from his lip. To stop it. A long silence followed. Takeda scowled. Stop what? Orloff's expression remained defiant. But Matthew saw something beneath it, not arrogance, but certainty. This wasn't just about Japan. This was bigger. Colin's voice was grim. He's not afraid to die. Matthew exhaled sharply. Because he knows something we don't. For the first time, a chill ran down Matthew's spine. Something else was coming. Chapter 264. The night was cold, and Matthew Hesh stood by the large window of his study, staring out at the dimly lit cityscape of Tokyo. A thin layer of fog rolled over the rooftops and beyond the embassy walls. He could see the flickering lanterns of guards patrolling the streets. His hands were clasped behind his back. His mind burdened by what had unfolded over the past few days. The attack on the succession ceremony. The capture of Orloff. And now, the chilling warning that they were already too late. He had played this game before, facing unseen enemies, dealing with conspiracies that festered in the dark, and he had barely survived. This time, though, it was different. Amber and his children were here. That changed everything. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Collins entered, looking just as exhausted as he felt. He didn't need to say anything. They were both thinking the same thing. It's time to leave, Matthew said finally, breaking the silence. Collins exhaled, nodding. You're making the right call, sir. We don't know how deep this conspiracy runs, and with what Orloff said, he hesitated before finishing. We can't risk your family getting caught in the middle of whatever this is. Matthew ran a hand through his hair. I hate leaving unfinished business, but I won't make the same mistake twice. Collins, the moment they tried to assassinate multiple world leaders, this stopped being just Japan's problem, and yet, we're the most vulnerable targets here. If something happens to Amber, Maverick, or Sophia because of my choices, he trailed off, shaking his head. I wouldn't forgive myself. Collins crossed his arms. So what's the plan? Matthew turned to face him fully. We leave by dawn. I'll appoint a special envoy to remain here and continue investigating on my behalf. Someone trustworthy, someone who won't get tangled up in Japan's political games. I want regular updates. And if we uncover solid proof of a larger operation, we'll deal with it from Amarathia. Collins nodded, but his face remained serious. Who do you have in mind? Matthew exhaled. Ambassador Harrington. He's a career diplomat, ruthlessly efficient, doesn't let emotions cloud his judgment, and he's been stationed here long enough to understand the dynamics. Collins smirked slightly. You mean he's a bastard, but he's our bastard. Matthew chuckled despite himself. Exactly, he'll keep the pressure on Yoshihido's government without making it look like Amarathia is overstepping. Collins rubbed his chin. And Takamura? He's already pissed off enough as it is. Matthew's expression darkened. He can be pissed all he wants. Japan needs to understand this is bigger than their internal politics. If Takamura starts stonewalling Harrington, we'll handle it diplomatically. Collins nodded, but the concern was still there. And what if this isn't just about Japan? What if this really is part of something much larger? Matthew turned back to the window, staring out at the city again. Then Amarathia will be ready for it. Tokyo Bay USS Amarathia. The pier was bustling with activity as Amarathian Marines secured the departure route. Soldiers stood in precise formation, their rifles slung over their shoulders. While naval officers prepared the USS Amarathia for departure, Matthew, Amber, and the children arrived under heavy guard. Maverick, dressed in a navy blue coat, clutched his father's hand while Amber held baby Sophia close to her chest. Wrapped in a soft woolen blanket. Why are we leaving so soon? Maverick asked, his small face scrunched with confusion. Matthew knelt down, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. Because it's not safe here anymore, buddy. Maverick frowned. But what about the samurai? You said I'd see more of them. Matthew chuckled softly. You will one day, but right now, I need to make sure we keep you safe. Maverick studied his father's face for a long moment before nodding solemnly. Amber, standing nearby, watched Matthew carefully. You're doing the right thing, she whispered. Matthew looked at her, his chest tightening. I know, but it doesn't make it any easier. She smiled softly, brushing her fingers against his. We'll face whatever comes next, together. He squeezed her hand before turning toward the gangplank. Collins and Admiral Parker were already aboard, making final preparations before stepping onto the ship. Matthew turned one last time toward the city. The Imperial Palace loomed in the distance. Bathed in the morning light, he could feel the shadows lurking behind it, plotting, waiting. They weren't finished here, not by a long shot, as the massive warship pulled away from Tokyo Bay. Matthew stood at the railing, watching Japan shrink in the distance. The air was crisp. The ocean calm yet endless. Collins approached, hands in his coat pockets. Harrington has his orders? Matthew nodded. He knows what to do. He'll keep us informed and apply pressure where needed. But if we want real answers, we might need to do some digging ourselves. Collins raised an eyebrow. Back in Amarathia? Matthew's grip on the railing tightened. If Orloff is telling the truth, if we're already too late, then we need to be ready. I want to know who in our own country has been talking to Russia, funding movements like the Order, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Collins exhaled. You think we have a leak? Matthew's eyes didn't leave the horizon. I think we've had one all along. The realization sent a chill through him. The coup attempt back home. The attack in Japan. The pattern was too similar to ignore. Someone was orchestrating all of this. And when he got back to Amarathia, he was going to find out who, no matter what it took. As the Amarathian fleet disappeared beyond the horizon, Emperor Yoshihito sat in his private chambers. Deep in thought across from him, Minister Takamura paced in frustration. We should never have allowed him to interfere, Takamura muttered. Amarathians have no place in our affairs. Yoshihito sipped his tea, his gaze unfocused. And yet he was right. Takamura stopped, glaring at him. Your Majesty, the Emperor set down his cup. You saw the way Orloff spoke. That was not the voice of a man afraid of death. He knew something far greater than just Japan's future. Takamura clenched his fists. Then we should handle this ourselves. Yoshihito's expression darkened. We will. But let us not deceive ourselves. This is no longer just about Japan. Silence filled the room. The Emperor stared out the window. Watching the waves roll against the shore, something was coming. And it would shake the world. Chapter 265. San Francisco, California. Port of San Francisco. The USS Amarathia sliced through the cold Pacific waters as it approached the docks of San Francisco Bay. The towering hills of the city were partially shrouded in morning mist, but the crowds gathered along the waterfront were unmistakable. Matthew Hesh stood on the deck, hands in his pockets, his coat flapping slightly in the wind behind him. Amber adjusted her hold on baby Sophia, while Maverick tugged at the hem of his father's coat. Why are there so many people, Daddy? Maverick asked, craning his neck to look at the thousands of onlookers packed near the docks. Matthew exhaled. Because they want answers, buddy. And he wasn't wrong. News of the assassination attempt in Japan had spread like wildfire across Amarathia and the world. Speculation was rampant. Some believed it was a failed coup. Others whispered about foreign powers trying to spark war. The newspapers had published contradictory reports, leading to even more confusion. As the ship closed the final distance to the pier, Collins walked up beside Matthew. Looks like the press is out in full force, he muttered. And from the looks of it, they're hungry. Matthew glanced toward the dock, where dozens of journalists from the country's largest newspapers, the Amarathian Post, the San Francisco Herald, the Liberty Times, were waiting impatiently, notebooks and cameras at the ready. Let them eat, Matthew said dryly. We're not hiding anything. Collins chuckled. Brave man. The moment the gangplank was lowered, the roar of voices erupted. Reporters shoved their way forward, calling out questions, trying to get the first word from the president himself. Matthew stepped down with Amber at his side. His security detail moving into position to keep the crowd from getting too close. Maverick stayed close to his father, his small hand gripping tightly onto his coat. Then the questions began. Mr. President, can you confirm if Russia was involved in the attack? Was this an attempt on your life, sir? Is Japan covering up the truth? Does this mean war between Amarathia and foreign powers? Matthew raised a hand, signaling for calm. The noise died down just enough for his voice to carry over the crowd. I understand that there are many questions and I will address them, but let me be clear. Amarathia is not at war, Japan is not at war, and we will not let fear dictate our actions. The journalists immediately fired back. Then what do you say about the claims that radical nationalists in Japan were behind the attempt? The investigation is ongoing, but I can assure you that Emperor Yoshihito and the Japanese government are committed to uncovering the truth. A reporter pushed forward. But why did you leave so quickly, sir? Was there a security risk? Matthew hesitated for only a second. He had expected this question. I left because I had a duty to return home, he said carefully. The safety of my family was a concern, yes, but I also have a nation to govern. And our allies in Japan understood that. Sir, do you believe the order is involved? Matthew's expression darkened slightly. We don't deal in speculation, we deal in facts, and the fact is, the people responsible will be held accountable wherever they are, whoever they are. The questions continued rapid, relentless. Matthew answered where he could, carefully dodging where he had to. This wasn't just about information, it was about maintaining stability. If he said too much, it could spark international tensions. If he said too little, Amarathia would look weak. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes, he raised a hand once more. That's all for now. I appreciate your patience, but there's work to be done. Collins stepped in, ushering them toward the awaiting carriage. Amber glanced at her husband, noting the way his jaw was set. You handled it well, she murmured as they climbed inside. Matthew sighed, rubbing his temple. I told them what they needed to hear, nothing more. Maverick leaned against him. Daddy, does this mean you have to go back to work now? Matthew looked at his son, his expression softening. Yes, buddy, but I promise I'll be home for dinner. Maverick beamed. Good. Mama makes the best roast chicken. Amber smirked. I do. With that, his security detail escorted the president's family to the awaiting automobile, which would take them to the airport. The journalists who weren't satisfied with the answers that they have got from the president chased him. But they were stopped by the security details who formed a protective barrier around him. The family hopped inside the automobile and then departed from the bay. Maverick pressed his face against the window, watching the streets blur past. Are we going back home now? He asked. Matthew ruffled his son's hair. Not quite yet, buddy. First, we're heading to the airport. Maverick's eyes widened. Are we flying? Matthew nodded. Yes, it'll get us back to Washington, D.C. much faster. Amber shifted Sophia in her arms, adjusting the blanket around their daughter. It's been a long journey, she said softly. I'm just glad we're almost there. The automobile pulled up in front of San Francisco International Airfield, a relatively new facility still under construction but already serving a growing number of flights. A private military aircraft awaited them on the tarmac. Its engines already warming up for departure, the security detail stepped out first, scanning the area before signaling that it was clear. Matthew exited the vehicle with Amber beside him, Maverick gripping his father's hand tightly as they made their way toward the plane. Collins walked up beside Matthew. We've got a direct route to D.C., should take a little over 10 hours. We'll have full radio contact with the White House the entire way. Matthew gave a small nod. Good. I need to be briefed on everything the moment we land. As they reached the stairs leading into the aircraft, Maverick paused. Daddy, do I get to sit by the window? Matthew chuckled, squeezing his son's hand. Of course, buddy. Amber shot her husband a knowing look. And what about me? Matthew smirked. You can sit by me. Amber rolled her eyes but smiled as they stepped aboard. As the engines roared to life, the plane taxied down the runway. Matthew exhaled, sinking into his seat as he gazed out the window. The cityscape of San Francisco grew smaller in the distance as they ascended into the sky. They were finally heading home. Chapter 266. The grand halls of the White House felt strangely unfamiliar as Matthew Hesh walked through them, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on him. His return had been met with relief and celebration. Amarathia's leader was back home, safe with his family. But Matthew had no time for comfort. There was something far bigger at play. The attack in Japan was just the first crack in what he now realized was a far deeper fracture in global politics. Orlov's words haunted him. You're already too late. Too late for what? As he entered the Oval Office, Collins was already waiting for him, stacks of documents spread across the desk. His expression was grim. You're not going to like this, Collins said, sliding a telegram across the desk. Matthew picked it up, his eyes scanning the coded message as he read. His blood ran cold. Source: Amarathian Intelligence Bureau. AB intercepted Russian communications. December 30th, 1897. Phase 1 successful. Tokyo destabilized. Internal fractures growing. Proceeding with Phase 2, mobilization of Pacific Fleet to be finalized by February. Japan must be forced into war. The words struck like a hammer. Matthew lowered the paper slowly. This wasn't just an attack, he murmured. They're pushing Japan into war. Collins nodded grimly. It gets worse. We've decrypted further messages. This wasn't just about Japan. Russia has been feeding weapons and resources into radical factions across Asia, China, Korea, even Indochina. They want a war. But not just any war, they want Japan to strike first, to make them the aggressors so they can justify an all-out retaliation. Matthew clenched his jaw. It was a setup, and he had nearly walked right into it. Collins continued, flipping through a stack of intelligence reports. Orlov cracked. It took some work, but we got him talking. He handed Matthew another document. Russian operatives infiltrated radical Japanese nationalist factions over the past 5 years. The attack on the Imperial Palace was meant to provoke extreme nationalists into taking over the government. forcing Emperor Yoshihito into submission. Phase 2 involved Russia responding by launching military strikes, claiming they were defending against aggression. If Japan declared war first, it would weaken its standing among Western nations, isolating them. Diplomatically, the ultimate goal, control of the Pacific, neutralizing Japan as a rising power before they could fully modernize. Matthew placed the papers down, running a hand down his face. This was never about revenge, he muttered. This was about ensuring Japan never became a true world power. Collins exhaled sharply, and now we have another problem. Japan knows they're preparing for war. In the heart of Tokyo, beneath the towering shadow of the Imperial Palace, a meeting of Japan's highest military and government officials was underway. Emperor Yoshihito sat at the head of the chamber, his normally calm expression tight with controlled fury. Across from him, General Yamagata, a veteran of Japan's modernization efforts, slammed a clenched fist onto the wooden table. This is an affront to the empire, he roared. They plotted in our own lands, attacked our own leaders. We cannot stand idly by while Russia moves against us. The other generals murmured in agreement. Minister Takamura, despite his usual diplomatic stance, looked equally shaken. It is clear now, Takamura said, his voice cold. The West has their own interests, but Russia has always feared us. Their expansion into Manchuria, their maneuvering in Korea, it was only a matter of time before they moved against us directly. Yoshihito exhaled slowly. War, he murmured. Silence fell. They all knew what this meant. Japan had spent years modernizing, following the Western example, but their navy was still growing, their army still adapting to new warfare tactics. They had strength. But could they face the full might of the Russian Empire? Sir, Yamagata pressed, we have one advantage. Yoshihito's eyes flickered up. We know their plan, the general continued. They believe we will strike first. They want the world to see us as the aggressor. But what if we move differently? Takamura frowned. What are you suggesting? A slow, predatory smile formed on Yamagata's face. If war is inevitable, let us not be the ones who fire the first shot. Let them come to us. Let them cross the line first. Yoshihito leaned back in his chair, considering the weight of the words. This was not just about revenge, it was about survival. Finally, he nodded. Prepare the navy, reinforce our borders. We will not start this war, but we will finish it. The urgency in the air was palpable as Matthew Hesh, Collins, and the Amarathian military heads gathered for an emergency briefing. We have direct confirmation from our contacts in Japan, an intelligence officer said. The emperor is preparing for war, but he won't strike first. Matthew exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. That means Russia still has a choice. If they realize their plan has been exposed, they might back down. Collins shook his head. Unlikely, the Tsar isn't the type to step away from a confrontation. His forces are already moving. Matthew turned to General Hastings, Amarathia's top military strategist. Can we afford to intervene? Hastings grimaced. We don't have the political will to enter a war in Asia, Mr. President. We can apply pressure, offer support, maybe even threaten economic consequences, but an outright military commitment? That's not something we can promise without serious debate. Matthew knew he was right. Amarathia had strength, but a war across the Pacific was not something the people were prepared for. We need to make sure this doesn't spread, Matthew muttered. Collins looked at him carefully. And what if it does? Matthew didn't answer immediately. The dominoes were already falling. The attack in Japan had been the first push. Now, Russia was moving its pieces, and Japan was ready to strike back. If they weren't careful, this could be the beginning of something far worse. Something the world wasn't ready for, something Matthew couldn't stop. He finally spoke. If this war begins, he said, then we need to make damn sure it doesn't become the first of many. Oh my God, why are a lot of things happening? During my presidency? Well, at least, sir, if there is a war, surely there will be profit from our war machines, Collins replied. Yes, selling weapons from both sides. Chapter 267. January 6, 1898, the world was holding its breath as news of Japan's military preparations spread. So did the looming shadow of war. The Russian Empire, unwilling to lose its hold in the Pacific, had begun mobilizing troops along its eastern borders, reinforcing naval bases in Vladivostok and deploying warships into contested waters. The message was clear. Russia was ready for a fight in the heart of the Imperial Palace. The War Council convened again, their expressions darker than before. Emperor Yoshihito sat with his hands folded, his expression unreadable as reports were delivered to him. General Yamagata, his top military strategist, had just returned from a tour of Japan's defenses. His face was grim. Our navy is ready, Yamagata said, his voice low and serious. We have reinforced the fleet in Sasebo and Yokosuka. Every battleship and cruiser we have is armed and awaiting orders, but there is a problem. Minister Takamura, still wary of an all-out war, narrowed his eyes. What problem? Yamagata exhaled sharply. We are still outnumbered. If Russia deploys its full might, we cannot hold our positions for long. We will need the element of surprise, or we risk annihilation. Yoshihito tapped his fingers on the table, considering the weight of the words. What about diplomacy? Takamura asked, though he already knew the answer. Is there any chance this can be avoided? Silence. The emperor finally spoke. The Russians are moving their fleets toward our waters and their troops are gathering at our borders. They do not want peace. Takamura clenched his jaw. Yamagata stepped forward. We cannot be seen as weak. If we do not fight, we will be swallowed. The world must know Japan will not kneel. Yoshihito slowly nodded. Then we will stand, but we will not strike first. If Russia wants war, let them take the first step into the abyss. Thousands of miles away, Tsar Nicholas II sat at the head of his grand war room staring at a massive map of the Pacific Theater. His ministers and generals surrounded him, their voices filled with barely restrained eagerness. We have Japan trapped, Grand Duke Alexei. The head of the Russian Navy declared, if they move first, we will crush them, and if they hesitate, we will force their hand. Tsar Nicholas narrowed his eyes, explain. Alexei smirked. We send our fleet into Japanese-claimed waters. We test their patience. We block their trade routes and harass their convoys. If we can get them to fire first, the world will side with us. General Fyodor Kozakov, the commander of Russia's Eastern Army, nodded in agreement. The West will not support an empire that acts as the aggressor. If Japan takes the bait, we will be seen as defenders. Nicholas took a deep breath, gripping the arms of his throne, and if they don't? Alexei's smile was razor-sharp. Then we strike anyway, but history will remember that they forced our hand. The Tsar nodded slowly, a cruel satisfaction in his eyes. Then let the games begin. Back in Amarathia, Matthew Hesh was growing more restless by the hour. The tension between Japan and Russia had reached a dangerous level. If something wasn't done soon, there would be no turning back. Collins paced near the large conference table. Flipping through the latest intelligence reports, the Russians are already making their move, he muttered. They're probing Japan's defenses, sending warships dangerously close to their shores. It's only a matter of time before someone fires a shot. Matthew pinched the bridge of his nose, and Japan, still holding their ground, but they're ready. The moment Russia crosses a line, they will respond. The president exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He needed to act fast. If this war erupted, it wouldn't just be Japan and Russia fighting. It would send shockwaves across the world. We need to intervene, Matthew finally said, his voice firm. Collins arched an eyebrow. How? We already said we wouldn't commit troops. We don't need to send troops, Matthew replied, but we do need to remind both sides what's at stake. If this war begins, it won't stop at Japan, it won't stop at Russia, it will tear apart the entire region. Collins sighed. You want to mediate? Matthew shook his head. No, I want to make them think twice. He turned to General Hastings, Amarathia's top military mind. How quickly can we deploy a naval presence to the region? Hastings hesitated. If we move now, we can have a fleet stationed near the Philippines in less than 2 weeks. Make it happen, Matthew ordered. Collins shot him a look. That's risky. If either side sees it as an act of aggression, then let them, Matthew interrupted. We're not taking sides, but we are making it clear that we are watching. Collins ran a hand through his hair. This is a gamble. Matthew's expression hardened. So is war. Days passed, and the world braced itself. In the Sea of Japan, Russian and Japanese fleets circled each other like predators, waiting for the first sign of weakness. Tokyo was silent but burning with unspoken fury. Moscow was quiet, yet filled with anticipation. Then, on January 10, 1898, the moment came. A Russian warship, the cruiser Pyotr Veliky, entered waters claimed by Japan. Admiral Togo, Japan's most seasoned naval commander, sent warnings, but the Russian vessel ignored them. Then it happened. A single shot rang out. No one knew which side fired first, but it didn't matter because within moments, the sea exploded into chaos. The war had begun. Matthew sat at his desk, the urgent telegram clutched in his hands. Sir, Collins said, his voice grave. It's official. Matthew slowly looked up. Say it. Collins exhaled. Japan and Russia are at war. The room fell into silence. Matthew Hesh closed his eyes, the weight of history pressing down on him. He had done everything he could, but war had come anyway, and now the world would burn. Okay, let's prepare for whatever's going to happen in this war. Yes, Mr. President. Chapter 268. The world watched in horror as war erupted in the Pacific. Newspapers across Amarathia and Europe splashed bold headlines across their front pages. Japan and Russia at war. Battles rage in the Sea of Japan. The Liberty Times, shots fired. Tokyo declares Russia the aggressor. The Amarathian Post, Tsar Nicholas promises swift victory, Japan will fall. The Moscow Gazette. The war had barely begun, but the propaganda machines were already in full motion. Tokyo, Japan. The Imperial War Room. Inside the heavily guarded walls of the Imperial War Room, Emperor Yoshihito stood with his military leaders, watching as messengers rushed in and out, delivering urgent updates from the battlefield. Admiral Hihikiro Togo, the commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had just returned from the front lines. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with fierce determination. Our fleet engaged the Pyotr Veliki near Tsushima Strait, Togo reported. We disabled her rudder, forcing her to retreat, but the Russians have responded aggressively. Their reinforcements are moving toward our waters. This is no longer a skirmish, it is a full-scale naval war. Yoshihito remained silent, his fingers gripping the imperial seal at his side. What of our land defenses? He asked. General Yamagata stepped forward. The Russians are massing troops along the Manchurian border. We expect an invasion force within the next few weeks. The emperor's face hardened. So it begins. Takamura, still reluctant to fully embrace the war, clenched his jaw. Have we received any word from Amarathia? A messenger stepped forward, bowing. Yes, Minister-President Hesh has sent a naval fleet to the Philippines as a warning to both sides. They are not committing to war, but they are making their presence known. Yoshihito considered this. Then we are truly alone in this fight. Togo straightened. No, Your Majesty. We have the spirit of our ancestors, and we have our own strength. The emperor nodded slowly. Then we fight. Japan will not surrender. Moscow, Russia. The Winter Palace across the world. In the frozen halls of the Winter Palace, Tsar Nicholas II was in an entirely different mood. A lavish feast was being held in celebration of the first battle. Generals, noblemen, and high-ranking officers dined on fine caviar, sipping expensive vodka as they laughed over war maps. At the head of the table, Grand Duke Alexei smirked. The fools actually think they can win. The Tsar swirled his drink lazily. They are stubborn, yes, but they are not Europe. They are an island nation with limited resources. Their time is running out. General Kozakov, a veteran of the Russian military, was less amused. Do not underestimate them, Your Majesty. Japan has modernized faster than we expected. Their navy, though smaller than ours, is highly disciplined. The Tsar scoffed. Discipline means nothing against numbers. We will drown them in fire and steel. Alexei chuckled. Then let us begin phase 2. Kozakov hesitated. Your Highness, the Amarathians. The Americans will do nothing. Alexei interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. Hesh is a politician. He plays at power, but he will not commit his forces to this. We control the Pacific now, and soon, we will have Japan at our feet. Washington, D.C. The White House Situation Room. Matthew Hesh leaned over the table, staring at the massive map stretched before him. Red markers indicated Russian naval movements, while blue represented Japan. The Pacific was a battlefield now. Collins stood beside him, arms crossed. The Russians are pushing hard. They're testing Japan's defenses, moving warships dangerously close to Korean and Chinese waters. General Hastings exhaled sharply. Sir, if Japan falls, Russia will control the entire Pacific. That means they could challenge our interests in the Philippines, Hawaii, even our western seaboard. Matthew's eyes darkened. We can't let that happen. Collins frowned. We have two choices: diplomacy or deterrence. We either negotiate for peace or we prepare for war. Matthew rubbed his temples. And what are our allies saying? Secretary of State William Harland adjusted his glasses. Britain is watching closely, but they won't act unless their trade routes are threatened. France is indifferent. The Chinese Empire is staying silent for now. But if Japan starts losing territory, they may be forced to get involved. Matthew sighed. Then we need to act before that happens. Call for a global summit. We need to gather the major powers and force a diplomatic solution. Collins hesitated. Sir, we might be past that point. The war has started. Do you really think Russia will negotiate? Matthew clenched his jaw. No, but if we don't try, then we're just waiting for the body count to rise. January 12, 1898. As diplomats talked, the war raged on. In the icy waters of the Tsushima Strait, the Japanese fleet, led by Admiral Togo, faced off against the Russian Pacific Fleet in the first major naval clash of the war. The sea was a battlefield. Japanese battleships roared, their massive cannons lighting up the darkened sky. Russian cruisers returned fire, their shells ripping through the waves. The thunder of war echoed across the ocean. Target their lead ship. Togo commanded. The Mikasa, Japan's flagship, fired a devastating broadside. The shells slammed into the Russian cruiser Admiral Kornilov, splitting its deck apart. Smoke filled the sky, ships burned, the sea turned red with the bodies of fallen sailors. But Japan held the line. Hours later, as the smoke cleared, Togo stood victorious. The Russian fleet had retreated, leaving behind the wreckage of their fallen ships. Japan had won the first battle, but it was only the beginning. The news arrived at the White House within hours. Collins rushed into the room, waving the latest telegram. Sir, Japan just decimated the Russian Pacific Fleet. Togo forced them into a full retreat. Matthew took the paper, reading the details. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a breath of relief. That means the war just got a lot more complicated. Collins muttered. Matthew nodded. Russia won't take this humiliation lightly. They'll double down. Hastings exhaled. And when they do, Japan will need help, whether we like it or not. Sir, we might have to choose a side. Matthew leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The war was escalating, and Amarathia wouldn't be able to stay out of it forever. Chapter 269. The Winter Palace, St. Petersburg. The grand halls of the Winter Palace were eerily silent as Tsar Nicholas II read the telegram from Vladivostok. His fingers clenched the paper so tightly that the edges crumpled. The words burned in his mind. Total defeat. The Pacific Fleet decimated. Admiral Kornilov dead. Japan holds Tsushima Strait. The Russian Empire, one of the greatest powers on earth, had lost to the Japanese. The Tsar's breath was slow. Control, but his eyes burned with fury. A group of ministers and generals stood before him, each waiting for his reaction. The air was thick with tension. No one dared speak first. Finally, Grand Duke Alexei, his closest advisor, took a step forward. Your Majesty, this is a setback. But it is not the end. We must. The Tsar slammed his crystal glass against the wall, shattering it. The room flinched. A setback. Nicholas spat. You call this humiliation a setback? His voice echoed through the chamber. The world is laughing at us. The West mocks us. Our empire, our mighty empire, has been shamed by a nation of fishermen. General Fyodor Kazukov, the commander of the Eastern Army, stepped forward cautiously. Your Majesty, we underestimated them. Their navy was stronger than anticipated, but we still hold the advantage in land forces. If we move now, move. Nicholas snapped. They have declared war on Russia. They have killed our men, sunk our ships, and spat in the face of our empire. His eyes narrowed, cold and vengeful. Burn them, crush them, show them the might of Russia. Silence. Alexei, ever the strategist, nodded slowly. If that is your command, then we must escalate. Japan has no true allies. If we push hard enough, we can force them into submission before the West has time to act. Nicholas sat down, running a hand over his face. His breathing slowed, his mind calculating. Then, finally, he spoke. We mobilize. All forces in Manchuria and Siberia are to prepare for invasion. Reinforcements from Moscow will be sent immediately. Our navy may be wounded, but our army will break them. Kazukov saluted. And the Japanese mainland? The Tsar's gaze darkened. If they dare resist, we will make them regret ever challenging us. January 16, 1898, Vladivostok, Russian Empire. A bitter cold wind howled across the military encampments as thousands of Russian troops gathered along the Manchurian border. Cannons, supply wagons, and endless lines of infantry stretched across the frozen landscape. In the command tent, General Kazukov stood over a massive map of the war front. Officers surrounded him, each awaiting orders. The Japanese have strengthened their positions, an aide reported. They expect us to invade there. Defenses in Korea and Manchuria have been reinforced. Kazukov smirked. Good, let them dig in, let them think they have a chance. He traced a gloved finger along the map. We will strike 3 fronts. Our main army will push into Manchuria, cutting off their supply lines. A secondary force will move south into Korea, ensuring no reinforcements reach the Japanese mainland. And finally, he tapped the Sea of Japan. The Black Sea Fleet is en route. We will land an expeditionary force on the northern coast of Japan. We will take their cities, burn their fields, break their will. A lieutenant hesitated. Sir, we are moving into enemy waters without naval superiority. The Pacific Fleet was destroyed. Kazukov turned sharply. Then we will take their ports. If we cannot fight at sea, we will fight on land. Let the Japanese drown in their own blood. The officers saluted, their expressions grim yet determined. The Russian counteroffensive had begun. Tokyo, Japan, inside the Imperial Palace, the air was tense as Emperor Yoshihito read the latest intelligence reports. The Russians were moving fast. They are not retreating, Your Majesty. They are doubling down, General Yamagata said gravely. Minister Takamura clenched his fists. We knew they would retaliate, but this is a full-scale invasion. Admiral Togo, still recovering from the Battle of Tsushima, spoke next. Our navy can hold them at sea, but if they land on our shores, he let the thought hang. The room was silent. Yoshihito looked up. Then we must not let them land. Yamagata nodded. We will need to reinforce Korea and Manchuria. If they establish a foothold, they will be impossible to remove. The emperor exhaled. How long do we have? Days, maybe a week. Takamura shook his head. If Amarantha does not intervene soon, we may be overwhelmed. Silence. Yoshihito's gaze flickered to the map of the Pacific. His mind was made up. Then we prepare for the greatest battle in our history. Washington, D.C. The White House was in crisis mode. Collins stormed into the Oval Office, slamming a fresh report onto Matthew Hesch's desk. The Russians aren't stopping, sir. They're mobilizing everything. Matthew picked up the report, reading it carefully. Full-scale invasion of Manchuria and Korea imminent. Russian troops moving toward Japan's northern coast. Matthew rubbed his temples. Damn it. Hastings spoke next. If Russia takes Japan, the balance of power in the Pacific shifts permanently. They'll control Asia, and if that happens, Amarantha is next. Collins nodded. We either act now or we let Russia rewrite history. Matthew exhaled slowly. He had avoided direct involvement, but now there was no more time. He stood. Get me a meeting with Congress. We need to act. Collins hesitated. Sir, are you saying we're going to war? Matthew stared at the map. I'm saying we can't stand by anymore. Silence. Collins nodded. I'll set it up. As he left the room, Matthew looked out the window, watching the cold Washington sky. The war had begun, and now Amarantha had to choose a side. Matthew Hesch sat at his desk, staring at the report in front of him. The weight of the decision he had to make pressed on him, but there was no time to hesitate. If Amarantha did nothing, Russia would overrun Japan, gaining full control of the Pacific. That would threaten Amaranthian trade, security, and influence in Asia. If they stepped in, it could mean war, something he had tried to avoid. Chapter 270. January 18, 1898. Washington, D.C. The White House. The tension in the room was thick as President Matthew Hesch stood before his cabinet. Members of Congress and senior military advisors. A large map of East Asia was pinned on the wall, covered in red markers that tracked Russia's land movements through Manchuria and naval projections in the Sea of Japan. Everyone waited for him to speak. Some stood, some sat stiffly in leather chairs. All of them were on edge. This is not just Japan's war anymore, Matthew finally said, breaking the silence. It's a war for control of the Pacific. He looked around the room. If Russia wins, they won't stop with Japan. Korea will be next. China follows after that. The entire region becomes a Russian sphere of influence, and we're locked out of the fastest-growing markets in the world. A senator from Vermont, Edwin Rowe, folded his arms, but siding with Japan, Mr. President? That's a bold move. Some would say it's a betrayal of the Western alliance. We're a Western nation. Japan is not. Murmurs of agreement followed. The old worldview still clung to many in the room that Europe and North America were the civilizing force, that unity among Western nations was paramount. Matthew didn't flinch. And what has that unity brought us? Endless talks and vague promises. Not one European power has stepped in to stop Russia. Not Britain, not France, not Germany. If anything, they're quietly hoping Russia wins so they can carve out what's left. But Japan's not one of us, another congressman added. They don't share our culture. Our what? Matthew cut in. Eyes sharp. Our skin color? Our religions? Our way of doing business? Silence. He continued. This isn't about culture, it's about strategy. If we let Russia dominate East Asia, we lose access to a region that will define the next century. Trade routes, resources, emerging markets, technology. He turned towards Secretary of Commerce Harold Ellis, who had been quiet until now. Ellis, what's our projected trade growth in Asia over the next 2 decades? Ellis straightened. If current trends hold, it could account for nearly 40% of our export economy by 1920, and that's without full trade treaties with China and Korea. Matthew nodded. You want to talk about betrayal? Sitting back and letting Russia seize all that is betrayal of Amarantha's future. Some in the room looked convinced, others still resisted. But it's war, Mr. President, said General Hastings. We commit troops, ships, money, people will die, and if Russia retaliates directly against us, then we respond, Matthew said firmly. This isn't about joining Japan's war, it's about preventing a Russian monopoly on the Pacific. It's about defending a balance of power that we benefit from. He looked around again. Let me ask all of you something. If we sided with Russia and helped them crush Japan, what makes you think they'd stop there? What's stopping them from turning on China, on Korea? On Indochina? They don't want allies, they want control. The room was quiet now, the gravity of his words setting in. And what happens, Matthew added, when Amarathia is boxed out of Asia altogether? When we have no say, no access, no presence. He walked slowly across the room, hand in his pocket. This isn't about East versus West. This isn't about race or culture. It's about survival, economic, strategic, national. He finally reached the front again. Amarathia sides with Japan. We will offer military support, economic assistance, and naval protection. We will not let Russia rewrite the future. There was a pause, then Collins, standing near the back, gave a small nod. The room erupted into mixed responses, some clapping, some sighing, a few outright shaking their heads, but the decision had been made. Matthew stepped out of the conference room into the hallway. Amber waiting nearby with Maverick in tow. How did it go? She asked. He gave a tired smile. We're siding with Japan. Amber nodded slowly. Good, they stood alone. They won't forget who stood with them now. Matthew looked out the nearby window toward the Capitol dome. Neither will history. Tokyo, Japan, January 20th, 1898. Emperor Yoshihito stood in the war room once again, but this time there was a change in the air. Admiral Togo handed him a fresh telegram from Amarathia. Yoshihito read it silently. It was a formal declaration of support, naval aid, munitions, advisors. Amarathia was stepping in. The emperor said nothing for a moment, then he looked up. Send a reply. Tell President Hesh Japan is grateful. General Yamagata smiled for the first time in days. We may just survive this yet. Street. Petersburg, the Winter Palace. The news of Amarathia siding with Japan hit the Russian court like a thunderclap. Tsar Nicholas threw the telegram across the room. They dare interfere? They dare side with those islanders? Grand Duke Alexei looked troubled. This changes everything. Then change everything? Nicholas growled. Double the invasion force. We'll bury them both. But the panic in the Russian War Council was clear. They had expected to crush Japan quickly. Now, they were facing a much bigger fight. Washington, D.C. Matthews stood on the White House balcony that night, looking out over the lights of the Capitol. Collins joined him, hands in his coat pockets. You know this is going to get ugly, Collins said. I know. But we've made our choice. Matthew nodded. We have. They stood in silence for a moment, then Matthew added, and if we win, we don't just save Japan, we secure our future. Collins looked out across the night sky. Let's hope the future is ready. Matthew didn't answer right away. He watched the stars above the Capitol, thinking of the storm to come. Then, with quiet resolve, he said, let the Russians come. Let the world watch. We're not just stepping into a war, we're stepping into history. Collins gave a faint nod, then stepped back inside. Matthew remained on the balcony a little longer, the wind brushing against his face. For the first time in days, he felt clear. The path forward wasn't safe, but it was necessary. Amarathia had chosen its side. Now, it was time to stand by it no matter the cost.